She didn't know that this ride would be her last. In broad daylight, she set off on her bicycle as she always did. The familiar road, the calm of nature. But something was waiting. Hours later, in a remote forest, her body lay sprawled between the trees, bleeding, broken, her eyes half open. She was still breathing, but justice wouldn't breathe for long. The killer vanished, leaving behind nothing but silence and a cold body. Days passed, and the case turned into a closed mystery, until one day the silence was shattered by a cup of coffee. Today, we take you to the quiet town of Mill Creek near Seattle in Washington State, where the story began in 1972. Jody Loomis was a 20-year-old girl, simple, full of love for art and beauty. She spent countless hours painting horses on her bedroom wall, inspired by her beloved horse. Jody grew up in a warm home with her parents, Otto and Laura Loomis, and her little sister, just 12 years old. Her dream was to become a nurse, a life devoted to caring for others. But fate decided her dreams would end suddenly, and her light would fade in the bloom of youth. It was the 3rd of August, 1972. Jody was getting ready to leave her home in Mill Creek, heading to the stables to ride Saudi. Before she left, she asked her younger sister if she could borrow her leather boots, not knowing those very boots would one day become a critical piece of evidence in a mysterious crime that would haunt investigators for decades. Shortly after Jody left, and not far from the stables, a couple was driving through a quiet forest near Mill Creek, searching for a secluded spot to sit together, away from the noise of the city. But their trip didn't go as planned. Suddenly, a massive tree trunk blocked the dirt road. The husband got out, muttering, thinking he could move it quickly. But as he approached, he saw something unexpected. The body of a young woman lying on her back in the dry grass. At first, he thought she might just be sleeping, but the truth was far worse. She was half naked, wearing long socks and leather boots. Her other clothes, a pair of jeans and a simple white t-shirt, were scattered on the ground. Her face was pale, her glasses tilted across her cheek, and on the right side of her head was a deep wound, blood trickling slowly. The man froze, then rushed to her, placing his finger under her nose. Yes, she was still breathing. He shouted to his wife, "She's alive!" Carefully, he lifted her fragile, cold body and placed her in the front seat. His wife sat beside her, gently holding her head, trying to keep her airway open, silently praying she wouldn't die in her arms. They reached the hospital. Doctors rushed her to the ER, but only minutes later, a doctor walked out, his face empty of hope. Jody was gone. She carried no ID, no bag, no documents, just a young woman found in the forest, discarded like she was nothing. Police began checking missing persons reports. After matching the description with her clothing and the boots her sister recognized, they contacted the family. The harsh truth was confirmed. The victim was Jody Loomis. With her death now official, the question shifted. Not will she survive, but who did this and why? In the autopsy room, the medical team prepared to examine the body, but what they found was more than evidence. It was a shock. Her body bore clear signs she had fought back, tried to survive, before finally surrendering. Investigators found dirt and leaves inside her underwear, as if she had fallen or been dragged along the ground. Her clothing wasn't arranged naturally. It was obvious she had been dressed again after being forcibly stripped. Stranger still, she was wearing only her right boot, and appeared to have been in the process of tying the left when a single bullet tore into her head. One shot, a small entry wound on the right side of her skull. One gunshot that shattered the forest's silence and stole a young life. The most crucial finding, however, was in her underwear, traces of semen. Investigators were clear: this was a sexually motivated homicide. There were no witnesses, no cameras, no suspects. The only evidence was what the killer had left on her body. And then, he was gone. Fingerprints were lifted, fibers and biological samples collected, but in the 1970s, DNA technology was far from what it is today. Days turned into months, and the case went cold. Jody's name sat in a dusty police file, silent, forgotten. But justice, though delayed, does not die. Years passed, one after another, and the file sat untouched on a shelf. No one opened it until more than 40 years after Jody Loomis's murder, when what had happened to her had faded into a dim memory in the archives of cold cases. But time had changed. The American police had entered a new era, an era where DNA was no longer just a scientific tool, but a weapon to unmask monsters. In 2018, Washington State's Cold Case Unit reopened Jody's file. Their first step: returned to the most critical piece of evidence, the semen sample collected during her autopsy. The shock was immediate and crushing. The original samples were gone. Everything froze for a moment. Investigators felt they had lost their one real chance. But one of them refused to give up. He decided to go back to what was left from the crime scene: Jody's clothes, her shirt, her jeans, her boots, her underwear. Every item was now a sealed box that might hold a single line of truth. The clothing was sent to a specialized crime lab. Days later, the call came. "We found a DNA sample on the left boot," one detective said. It was a moment of hope, a fragile thread to finally hold on to. But hope was still fragile. They needed a suspect whose DNA matched, yet the FBI database returned no matches. They had a rare genetic profile, but no direct hit in law enforcement databases. So investigators turned to the revolutionary method that had changed the game entirely: forensic genetic genealogy. This technique doesn't search for the killer himself, but for his relatives. The DNA profile was uploaded to a public genealogy database, one typically used to trace family origins or find missing relatives. Algorithms began comparing, cross-referencing, and linking thousands of profiles, until the first lead emerged: several partial matches to members of a family named Miller. Detectives began building the family tree by hand, connecting names, ages, locations, migration records, and dates. Eventually, the net tightened until only one man remained, the only one in the family with a sexual criminal record: Terrence Miller. By then, he was in his early 70s, living a seemingly ordinary life with his wife, appearing to be a quiet, unremarkable citizen. But his past wasn't clean. In the late 1970s, just a few years after Jody's murder, he had been arrested for sexual assault and the rape of a minor. But he hadn't gone to prison. He was sent to a treatment facility instead. Now, decades later, he was the prime suspect. But they still needed one final confirmation: a fresh DNA sample, taken without him ever knowing. Police began secretly watching him. One night, Terrence Miller was at a local casino. He sat at a table, ordered a cup of coffee, drank it calmly, then stood up and left. What he didn't know was that detectives were watching from a distance. The moment he walked out, an investigator stepped in, pulled the coffee cup from the trash, sealed it in a sterile evidence bag, and sent it straight to the crime lab. A week later, the call came, the decisive one. The DNA was a perfect match to the sample found on Jody's boot. After more than 46 years, the killer who had escaped justice was finally exposed. Terrence Miller, the man who thought time would bury his crime, was now charged with first-degree murder. But despite the gravity of the charge, he was released on bail, awaiting trial. During that time, police recorded phone calls between him and his wife. In one, his voice shook. I'm going to prison. They have the DNA. They've got me. Then, on a Monday morning, while the jury was still deliberating, investigators got a shocking call. Terrence Miller had killed himself inside his home. He had chosen to close the chapter himself, to escape his fate but not his guilt. Hours later, the jury returned to the courtroom and delivered their verdict. Terrence Miller, guilty. Though he never served a single day behind bars for his crime, the world now knew his name and what he had done to Jody. He was no longer just another shadow in the dark. And so the curtain fell on one of the strangest cases in recent history. But our journey through unsolved mysteries is far from over. There are still many cases waiting for someone to uncover their secrets. What do you think about the killer's fate? Do you believe justice was truly served?